So starting off with the framework, they talk about this absolutely necessary and essential. We agree with the overall definition that has to be absolutely necessary. However, they say that if alternatives exist, that they need to prove that we need to prove that GMOs are better than alternatives. That's not true. We only need to show that GMOs are an essential aspect, and they need to prove that they need to be mutually exclusive from GMOs, because if those alternatives can exist in conjunction with GMOs and advocate for overall improvements in food security, and GMOs can still be deemed an essential piece of the puzzle. Even if they're not the dominant factor in food security, they can still be a very important factor in food security, and indeed an essential factor. So with that in mind, let's look on to my opponent's main contentions, where they first talk about sustainability, and the main issue is with monocultures and some of the agricultural practices advocated by GMOs. The first is the issue with monocultures. First of all, this is not by any means unique to GMOs. Every industrialized farming system has monocultures where they plant the same crop. You don't see a huge amount of industrial nations planting different crops on the same field. So this is by no means unique to GMOs, and they don't show how GMOs significantly increase the adoption of monocultures. So there isn't an overall impact. And indeed, even so far, they haven't shown any impacts on that contention and how that affects food security. Next, they talk about these super weeds and super pests, and they say how 318 million more pesticides or pounds of pesticides have been used since the adoption of GMOs. But that's not because GMOs have used more pesticides. That's because more GMOs are being planted. So because GMOs make up 80% of the total area, then of course it means that the pesticides used on those GMOs are going to be increased because there's more of them around. So they're not showing the causality is due to the adoption of GMOs, but realistically it's because of the types of crops that are being used in the first place. And finally, looking to the creation of these superweeds, they're not unique to GMOs, and GMOs haven't shown any increase in the superweeds. Mark Brazo of the Genetic Literacy Project writes on October 1st, 2014, that prior to GMOs, there was an average 13.1 cases of herbicide-resistant weeds per year. However, after 1996, when GMOs were adopted, that dropped to 11.4 cases. So superweeds are not only not increasing, they've actually decreased as a result. And finally, Carrie Gilliam of Reuters writes in September 17, 2014, that currently Dow Chemical has developed an alternative GMO known as Enlist that is herbicide tolerant to multiple different herbicides. So there's not the big threat of superweeds if you can use multiple different herbicides. Next, they talk about this issue of soil degradation, how GMOs are harming that. First of all, based on our second contention, subpoint A, we're actually conserving land because GMOs need to use less land to produce the same yields, but holistically, there haven't been any meaningful impacts. Olivier Sandino writes for Biochemical Engineering/Technology in 2007 that so far, the differences when it comes to BT corn versus conventional corn in terms of soil quality isn't as big of a difference between conventional corn versus other agricultural practices, so there hasn't been a significant increase in soil degradation as a result of GMOs. And finally, GMOs actually advocate for the use of no-till or no-till agriculture, which actually conserves soil fertility. As Klaus Ammann writes for Trends in Biotechnology in August 2005, that 54% of growers cited the introduction of glyphosate-tolerant soybeans as the factor that had the greatest impact towards the adoption of reduced tillage or no-till methods. So we're actually showing that they're conserving soil fertility and soil quality. And finally, my opponents bring up all these alternatives, specifically agroecology alternative. However, that's not a major impact, and the one study they cite from Pretty, the Pretty study has a prerequisite that all the project examined had to be successful. So it's not a representative study. In fact, it's hugely biased. Instead, Laura Salisi from the International Institute for Environment and Development writes in June 2014 that agroecology is far more labor-intensive, requiring more labor, and that more poor families won't be able to adopt them. And this also harms the women development contention that we talk about holistically, because those women will be forced to work in the farms instead because of the higher labor demands. Next, they talk about accessibility and how this is displacing small farmers, but that just isn't true. The International Service for Acquisition of Agrobiotech Applications writes in January 2015 that over 94.1% of GM farmers are small and resource poor in developing countries, so they're not showing the impact. And finally, looking to Argentina specifically, that weak intellectual property laws have from Greg Taxler of Auburn University in 2006, that actually those farmers in Argentina aren't subject to the same intellectual property laws of GMOs, and that they're allowed to use these without having to pay those fees, and they're able to reuse these seeds every single year. And Luisa Maserani writes in 2013 that the vast majority of Argentinian farmers actually approve of GMO use. Next, looking to this issue of waste, there are numerous GMOs that actually solve for the issue of waste. Melli et al. For the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences writes in February 9, 2010, that actually there have been GMO tomatoes that increase the shelf life of foods by up to 30 days, so that's actually decreasing the amount of impact that they have. And finally, they talk about all these poverty issues. However, we're showing you in case that GMOs actually increase farmer incomes and that they've reduced food insecurity by 15 to 20% as a result of their adoption. And for those reasons, we urge you to affirm.